Oh, you put it over there.
I just don't understand.
That's good. All right. Let us begin.
Right.
We are in Zechariah chapter 9. Last week we famously accomplished 2 verses.
Yeah.
9 and 10. Verse 9, of course, is talking about the first coming of Christ. It speaks specifically of His triumphal entry into Jerusalem on what we call Palm Sunday. And what we did, and spent part of our time doing, is going through the prophecy about this in Daniel 9, verses 24 through 27. Went through the numbers and demonstrated from the edict that was given, the 73,880 days that were predicted, that on the very day, the last one, Christ came up, ascended to Jerusalem from the east to the top of the mount, and of course they put down the palm branches and declared Him Messiah King. And this is what verse 9 talks about, that He's declared Messiah King. Behold, your King has come to you. Right? Now, the second verse, 10, we have a gap of quite a few years. Okay? And of course He says, I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem, and the bow of war will be cut off, and He will speak peace to the nations, and dominion will be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. This, of course, is the result of His second coming. This is the establishment of the millennial kingdom, the 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth. And we discussed that and went through some Old Testament scriptures about it. So let's read verses 11 through 13 and start on the next part of this and see if we can finish this chapter tonight. He says, As for you also, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I have set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. Return to the stronghold, O prisoners, who have the hope. This very day I am declaring that I will restore double to you, for I will bend Judah as my bow, and I will fill the bow with Ephraim, and I will stir up your sons, O Zion, against the sons of Greece, and I will make you like a warrior's sword. Now, the question, of course, is, what event is this discussing? It's obviously speaking of a war. And it would appear, I think, when you read the text, that it is not the war of Armageddon, but it's a different war. So we're going to discuss what that war is. Remember, prophecy is very, very commonly, it has very commonly double or even triple fulfillments to it. It's fulfilled at one age, it's fulfilled in a different way at another age, it's fulfilled a third way possibly. A good example of this is what we just studied, I think, 2 weeks ago about Antiochus Epiphanes in the 11th chapter of Daniel. Antiochus comes, marches into Jerusalem, takes over the city, slaughters, over a period of about 9 years or so, slaughters about 1.2 million Jews. He puts the Jews under his control and, of course, has a standing army there, and they're horribly persecuted for that period of time. Okay? He goes into the temple, into the Holy of Holies. He slays a pig. He throws it all over the inside of the Holy of Holies. He desecrates the Ark of the Covenant, covers it with pig blood, and sets up an image of the god Zeus in the Holy of Holies. This is called the abomination of desolation. Okay? That's the technical term for it. It was predicted by Daniel that he would do it. And about 350 years later, more like 450 years later, it's exactly what happened. Okay? Now, but there's another fulfillment also. Take this one as an example. Paul tells us in 2 Thessalonians 2, I believe, that an event will occur where a person, and we call him the Antichrist, at the 3.5-year mark of the 7-year tribulation period, he goes into the temple. He desecrates it. He stops all regular temple service and sacrifice at that point. So, first fulfillment, future fulfillment. Again, here we have an historical fulfillment and a future fulfillment in these verses. And I'll show you tonight how that works. Now, he starts out in verse 11 talking about the blood of the covenant. It's the beginning place. Why don't you turn first back to Exodus chapter 24, verse 8, and let's kind of see the beginning of God setting up the issue of the blood of the covenant. So, Exodus 24, verse 8. And look what Moses is told to do. It's unusual. And think about why he's told to do it this way. So Moses took the blood and sprinkled it where? On the people. Not on the altar first. On the people. Okay? And said, behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. Now, some people will say, well, why did he use blood? What's the deal here? Well, if you go back to the 9th chapter, you don't have to turn here, but if you go back to the 9th chapter of Genesis, verse 4, you see one of the first mentions of blood. And God says a very specific thing about it. It's a prohibition. This is, of course, around the time of the events of the flood. And verse 4 of Genesis 9 says, only you shall not eat flesh with its life in it, that is, its blood. For surely I will require your lifeblood from you, from every beast I will require. In other words, if they commit murder, they spill the blood of another person. Actually, this is not the first reference to God using death and blood for his purposes. There's one even before that in Genesis. Do you remember what it was?
Cain.
Even before that. Yeah, that's good. Cain slew his brother. Okay, how?
When Adam and Eve sinned and they were hiding with the fig leaves,
God
made a covering for them.
Yes.
Of an animal.
He killed an animal himself and made a covering for them. He spilled blood. Okay? So God uses blood as a symbol of his forgiveness and his covering of sin. And of course it starts here, and progressively we learn more and more through the prophets until, of course, we get the New Testament, then it becomes much more obviously seen. So let's turn to the New Testament. Turn to Hebrews chapter 10. Keep your finger there in Zechariah. Hebrews 10, and let's see how the author of Hebrews explains this. I'm going to start reading in verse 1 of Hebrews 10. For the law, since it has only a shadow of the good things to come, which is a great way, by the way, to explain the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay? There's a shadow in the Old Testament, and it's revealed more specifically in its fulfillment in the New. That's constantly back and forth. Constantly God does it that way. He says, since it's a shadow of good things to come, and not the very form of the things, in other words, it's not complete, it can never, by the same sacrifices year after year, which they offer continually, make perfect those who draw near. He says, verse 4, okay? He says, for it's impossible for the blood of bulls and of goats to permanently take away sin. Therefore, when he comes into the world, quote, he says, sacrifice and offering thou hast not desired, but a body thou hast prepared for me. In whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin thou hast taken no pleasure. Then I said, behold, I have come. In the roll of the book it is written to me, to do thy will, O God. And then verse 10, by this will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. He is the sacrificial lamb. He is the blood that is spilled for our sake. And this is what certainly Zechariah is alluding to here in verse 11. Now, interestingly enough, in the next phrase of verse 11 in Zechariah, you see, he says, "I set the prisoners free from the waterless pit." Now, it's interesting, and then let me go to 12. "Return to the stronghold, O prisoners who have hope." In the Hebrew, it is actually constructed correctly here, at least in my New American Standard. In my New American Standard, it says, "those who have the hope." And in Hebrew, it uses the specific article. Not any hope, but rather the hope, the specific one. Now, let's look at that for a second. Keep your hand here in Zechariah and turn to Acts 26. Paul, being the good student that he was of the Scriptures, makes a very interesting application to this that we find in two places in Acts. Acts 26 and Acts 28. So go to Acts 26 first. And we're going to look at verse 6. This is where Paul is taken for a trial. He's taken to King Agrippa first, the local guy, okay? And he's having a hearing before him. And he says, as he's addressing Agrippa in the court there, he says, "And now I am standing trial for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers." The hope of the promise. Verse 7, the promise to which our 12 tribes hope to attain. Notice he says, hope to attain. They haven't attained it yet. Okay? As they earnestly serve God night and day. So here's a reference to this hope. Turn over 2 chapters to Acts 28. And let's look at verse 20. Now here he's making a defense in Rome. He's now traveled from Israel. They sent him because he appealed as a Roman citizen to go to Caesar. So he's now traveled, had a shipwreck, had all kinds of unbelievable adventures, and now he's in Rome. In verse 20, it says, "For this reason, therefore, I requested to see you and to speak with you, for I am wearing this chain," that is, he's in a private home chained to a Roman guard at this point. He says, "For I'm wearing this chain for the sake of the hope of Israel." What is the hope of Israel?
Messiah.
Keep going. And it's more than that. It is the Messiah, but it's more than that.
Israel will be restored.
But how does that occur?
War.
What's Israel's problem now in relationship to Messiah?
They're rejecting.
They have rejected him still. They don't believe him. The hope for Israel is when they believe him. And I'll show you the verses. Okay? It's always been God's plan. You know, we're in this 2,000-year interlude called the church age. But it's an interlude. Okay? It didn't start out with the church. It started out with national Israel all the way until Christ came. And, of course, the events of the Gospels. And Paul tells us in Romans 11, verse 25, that finally the covering over the eyes of the nation of Israel will be taken away, and they will see and claim their Messiah. That's always been the hope. That's always been the intent. Okay? Now, he also says, set free from the waterless pit. I think there are two people that were thrown notoriously in a pit in the Old Testament. The first one, well, not in order the first one, but it's actually the second one in order,
Jeremiah.
was Jeremiah. And you find it in Jeremiah 18, verses 20 and 22. Jeremiah is not exactly the most popular prophet in Israel. Okay? Matter of fact, they hate him. They persecute him. But, as a result of that, they decide one time the way to get rid of him and shred him up is to throw him in a waterless pit. And they do. But there's another person. Joseph. Joseph was thrown in a pit. Now I want to show you something here. Okay. Just a second. It went off, so I found this really interesting chart. Okay. Oh, I think turned off too. There we go.
We had to read that really fast.
Right, I mean, I didn't quite say all that.
Turn TV back up.
Okay. Okay, let's go through some of these. Okay? These are the parallels between the life of Joseph and the life of Jesus. Okay? They are remarkable. They're remarkable. So, Joseph was loved by his father. It's said in Genesis 37. And of course, what is it? It's said in Matthew 3:17. Jesus is the beloved of his father. Joseph's brothers did not believe him and hated him, as recorded in the 37th chapter of Genesis. What happened with Jesus? The Jews didn't believe Christ, John 7, okay, and they hated him. And of course, sought to put him to death. Joseph's brothers rejected his right to rule. Remember, he has this dream that he interprets, which does not make his brothers very happy, okay, because he is going to be over them in the dream. The Jews did not, of course, the Jewish leaders said, we will not have this man rule over us, as recorded in Luke 19:14. Joseph's brothers conspired against Joseph. They threw him in the pit and conspired to sell him off. Okay? In the same way, the Pharisees, the Jews, took counsel against Jesus. They stripped Joseph of his garment, the multicolored tunic that his father made for him. Okay? And of course, in Matthew 27, we see here at Jesus' crucifixion that they stripped Jesus. Joseph was sold for silver. That's the money they got from the traders as they trafficked him, as we call it. It's a fair way to put it. He was human trafficked at that time. In the same way, of course, we know Jesus was sold for 30 pieces of silver. Everything Joseph put that was put to his hand prospered. One tragedy after another, but it always turned out well in terms of what he did. And of course, in Isaiah 53, speaking of Messiah, it says, "And the pleasure of the Lord prospered in his hand." Let me move down here. All right. Now, all things were laid into Joseph's trust once he became appointed chancellor in Egypt. Okay? In the same way, God gave all things unto the son's hand in John 3:35. Okay? Joseph's brothers, when they came to Egypt to get food, didn't recognize him. Of course, he was dressed like an Egyptian, and that's certainly they hadn't seen him for years. The Jews did not recognize their own Messiah. Joseph was tempted, but he didn't sin. Think of Potiphar's wife, right? In the same way, Jesus was tempted in all things and yet was without sin. Hebrews 4:15.
And they were both punished.
Yes, they were. Joseph was bound, okay, by his brothers when they threw him in the pit. Jesus was bound, of course, for the first part of his crucifixion. Joseph was condemned with two criminals. Jesus was crucified with two criminals. One criminal was given life and the other condemned. Remember, the baker and the cupbearer?
Yeah.
Okay? What happens on the cross? All right? Jesus was told the criminals, "Today, one of them you shall be with me in paradise." Move up a little bit more. Okay? Joseph was trustworthy and wise, it's stated in Genesis 41. God said about Jesus, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." Joseph's brothers bowed their knee to him eventually. as he was Chancellor of Egypt. And of course, in Philippians 2, we're told in the future that every knee shall bow to Christ the Messiah. Joseph was 30.
And that was also a problem. That's what made Jacob upset and the brothers upset, because he prophesied. They were both prophesied before that happened.
That they would bow down to him.
Right.
Absolutely, to his sign.
I don't mean to rewrite your chart.
No. Good. Joseph was 30 years old at the time in which he advanced into the chancellorship of Egypt. He started at age 17, and he had 13 years of worse and worse and worse things happen to him for 13 years in a row, okay? And of course, Jesus was about 30 years old, it says in Luke 3:25, when he began his ministry. God planned the suffering of Joseph in advance to save many. We're told in Genesis 50. He suffered for the sake of the salvation of the Jews, for his family to come down and prosper. And of course, Jesus said, God so loved the world that he became his only begotten Son, whoever should be saved, right? Joseph was made ruler over all of Egypt. Jesus said, all power has been given unto me. Joseph married a foreign bride, a Gentile bride, specifically, okay? We see this in Genesis 41:45. Believers in Christ are joint heirs with him. We are the Gentile church, right? God, it says in the Old Testament, his wife is Israel. But we are the bride, as the church, right? Joseph was cast into a pit and then later delivered out of it. Jesus died and descended into the lower parts of the earth, called the abysso, the abyss, and later ascended then, of course, into heaven. We're told that in Ephesians 4:9. Joseph was in prison based on false charges.
Yeah.
He didn't do what he was accused of. During the trial, Jesus had false witnesses that brought in false testimony against him. Joseph's brothers later repented for what they did to him. Quote, and here's Zechariah, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn. The day will come where the Jews will recognize their Messiah. Okay?
Joseph's brothers repented because they were scared out of their boots.
Part of it. Part of it, that's true. Now, again, many things in the Old Testament are typological. They're true, they're historical, they're accurate, but they also have many times a future application in them. And that's a good example of it, I think.
The tabernacle was typified Christ.
Exactly.
Everything.
Yeah, that's a fairly large part of the book of Hebrews, explaining all that, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
All right, now, so we see that they'll be set free from this waterless pit. Under D, he says in that verse that they'll be restored double, which literally means complete restoration. That Israel one day will have complete restoration. And this, of course, will occur in the Messianic kingdom, the 1,000-year rule. Look at Isaiah 61:7. Turn back from Zechariah to Isaiah 61. And verse 7. Isaiah, speaking of the millennial kingdom and Israel, says, instead of your shame, you shall have a double portion. Instead of humiliation, they will shout for joy over their portion. Therefore, they will possess a double portion in their land. Everlasting joy will be theirs. The millennial kingdom will highlight Israel. The center of the world politically will be Jerusalem. The Messiah king on his throne. The nations have to come to Jerusalem. They have to be judged by the Messiah. Okay? And it's told all through Isaiah about the millennial kingdom that if you want to have blessings, if you're a Gentile nation, if you want to have blessings in your country, it depends on how you treat the Jews. That's how you get blessings. think of what Jesus said in Matthew 25. Okay, he talks about the sheep and the goats judgment. And what is it? He says, I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was naked and you clothed me. Okay, I was poor, I was sick and you took care of me. He goes to these and they say, Lord, how did we do that? And he said, you as you do it unto these, Israel, the Jews, so you've done it unto me. This is, again, talking about the end. So, we also have this statement that they're to return to the stronghold. That literally means they're to return to the promised land. They're to return to Jerusalem. If you want to see a reference to that, I'm not going to turn there right now, but you can look at Joel 3:16. It says that.
Like John 3:16.
Right. Now, it says in this section in Zechariah that they will raise up mighty men over the sons of Greece. Now you think, how? Well, I'm going to inform you about a little bit of history here. There was an event that occurred starting about 166, 167 BC called the Maccabean Revolt. Okay? Its most famous leader was Judas Maccabee. We have the extra biblical history books, okay, about it called First Maccabees and Second Maccabees. They are accurate histories of the Jews during this time. All right? Now, let me read some things to you. I want to explain about the Maccabean Revolt to you because it was a unique time in Israel.
Excuse me, question.
Yes.
The book of Maccabees, is it in the,
Apocrypha.
in the Catholic Bible?
Yes.
Okay.
And I believe it's also in the Orthodox Bibles too.
Okay.
Okay? But it is a history book. It's an accurate history book. All right. Now, sit back. I'm going to read a little bit to you about the Maccabean Revolt. I want you to understand what happened, why it happened, and the events of it. I'm reading from Josephus in his famous history called Antiquities of the Jews. All right? And I'm starting in, this is the 12th book, and this is actually starting in chapter 6. So I'm going to read a few things to you. Now, at this time, there was one whose name was Matthias, and he dwelt in a town called Modin. He was the son of John, the son of Simon, the son of Asmaeus, the priest of the order of Jorib, and he was a citizen of Jerusalem. Matthias had 5 sons. John, who was called Gaddis, Simon, who was called Matthias, Judas, who was called Maccabeus, Eleazar, who was called Aran, and Jonathan, who was called Aphas. So these are his 5 boys. Now this Matthias lamented to his children the sad state of their affairs, and the ravage made in the city, and the plundering of the temple. And the multitude were under what the multitude and the calamities they'd been put under. And he told them that it was better for them to die for the laws of their own country than to live so ingloriously as they were doing. See, Antiochus Epiphanes, when he went and lost his battle with the Ptolemaic kingdom at one point, remember I told you the history, you'll find it in Daniel chapter 11, he turns around from his inglorious defeat and marches where? Jerusalem. And decides that since he's already, pissed off, that he's going to take it out on some people. And he takes it out on the Jews. And he occupies Israel for over 10 years, about 11 years, really. Okay? Now Matthias said that he would not bow to King Antiochus, and that if all the other nations would obey the commands of Antiochus, either out of fear or to please him, yet he would not, nor would his sons, leave the religious worship of their own country and heritage. But as soon as he ended his speech, he's now in the temple, okay, saying this, there came one of the Jews into the midst of them, and sacrificed to Antiochus as had been commanded by the king. At which point Matthias, with great indignation, ran upon him violently, also his sons, who had swords with them. And they slew both the man and the man himself that sacrificed, and also the king's general, named Apelles, who was compelling them to make sacrifice to Antiochus. So here's the beginning of an open rebellion that's occurring. You know, they decide, we're not doing this, we're not putting up with it. It says, if, said he, anyone be zealous for the laws of his country and for the worship of the Lord, let him follow me. And when he had said this, he made haste into the desert with his sons and left all his substance in the village. So, the rebellion starts. The boys, their children, wives, and the father take off into the hill country. But when he had ruled 1 year, many people in Israel started to realize that he was a real leader, Matthias, okay? He had fallen into distemper, and he called his sons to him and set them round him and said, "O my sons, I'm going the way of all the earth. And I recommend to you my resolution to beseech to you not to be negligent in keeping it, but to be mindful of desires of him who begat you and brought you up, and to preserve the customs of our religion, and to recover your ancient form of government, which is in danger of being overturned, and not to be carried away with those that either by their own inclination or out of necessity betray our traditions, but to become such as sons are worthy of me, and to be above and be above all force and necessity." And then he says to them, "Sons, your bodies are mortal and subject to fate, but they receive a sort of immortality by the remembrance of what actions they have done. And I would have you so in love with this immortality that you may pursue after glory, and that when you have undergone these great difficulties, you might not scruple for such things, such as to lose your own lives." So he says to them, dedicate your lives to our faith, our belief in throwing these pagans out of here, even if it costs you his life. Because again, isn't it interesting his point of view? This world is not my home. I'm just to pass them through. Okay? When Matthias had thus discoursed this with his sons, he died a little afterward and was buried in the town of Modin. And all the people made great lamentations for Matthias, whereupon his son Judas took upon him the administration of the public affairs. So Judas now kind of steps forward after his father has died. Now when Apollonius, the general of the Samaritan forces of Antiochus Epiphanes, heard this, he took his army and made haste to go against Judas, who met him and joined him in battle. And Judas beat him and slew many of his men, among them Apollonius himself, who was their general. And when Seron, another general of Antiochus, who was general of the Celesyria faction, heard that many had joined Judas, and he was about him an army sufficient for fighting and for making war, he determined to make an expedition against Judas, as thinking it became him to endeavor to punish those that had transgressed the king's instructions. So Judas encouraged them and said to them that victory and conquest of enemies are not derived from the multitude of their armies, but in the exercise of piety towards God. And for innocence, that is the greatest characteristic for the strongest army. And by this speech he gave, he induced his men to contemplate the multitude of the army, and they fell upon General Seron, and upon joining battle with them, they beat the Syrians. And when their general fell among the rest, they all ran away, that is, Antiochus' forces, with speed. It's a second victory. Now when Antiochus heard these things, he was very angry at what had happened. So he got together all of his own army and even included mercenaries. And when Lysias, who was acting as king when Antiochus was away with the army, delivered to them 40,000 foot soldiers and 7,000 horsemen, and sent these against Judah. But when the enemy sent General Gorgias with 5,000 foot and 1,000 horse soldiers, that he might fall upon Judas by night. So that when Gorgias found no enemy in Judas's camp, but suspected that they had retired or run away, okay, and had hidden themselves among the mountains, he then took off to the city of Emmaus. So he commanded the trumpeters to, now we're talking about Judas now. Judas engages him, and he commanded the trumpeters to sound for battle, and thus falling upon the enemies when they did not expect it, and thereby astonishing and disturbing their minds, he slew many of them that resisted him, and went on pursuing them as far as Gadara and the plains of Idumea and Ashdod, and these that fell were about 3,000. Next victory Judas had. Okay? Am I boring you with this, or you want to hear a little bit more?
No, this is interesting.
Okay. Now, when therefore Gorgias understood that these things were this way, and perceived that those that were with Judas were ready to fight, they also were frightened, and his army was put to fright. But when Judas, as though he had already beaten Gorgias' soldiers without even fighting, returned and seized all the spoils that Gorgias' army left. And he took a great quantity of gold and silver and purple and blue, and they returned home with joy, singing hymns to God for their good success. Notice that Judas and his father and his brothers all did this because of their faith. They didn't put trust so much in their... They were undermanned. They didn't have the equipment of Antiochus' army, but they had faith. When, therefore, the generals of Antiochus' armies had been beaten this many times, Judas assembled the people together and told them that after these many victories which God had given them, they ought to go up to Jerusalem and purify the temple. Now here's the key event. And offer the appointed sacrifices. But as soon as he, with the whole multitude, had come to Jerusalem, and found the temple deserted, and its gates had been burnt down, and plants growing in the temple all and around, and on account of its desertion, he and those who were with him began to lament, and were quite confounded at the sight and condition of the temple. When therefore he had carefully purged all of this, and had brought in new vessels, that is the implements of the temple, the candlestick, the table of showbread, the altar of incense, which were made of gold, which he'd just stolen from the army of Antiochus, okay? And it says, and that he built a new stone altar that he gathered together, not as such as were of hewn iron tools. In other words, you weren't allowed to cut stones to make an altar. You had to place them together. So on the 5th and 20th day of the month of Kislev, which the Macedonians call Applians, they lighted the lamps that were in the candlestick, that is the menorah, and offered incense upon the altar of incense, and laid the loaves upon the table of showbread, and offered burnt offerings upon the new altar of burnt offering. Now it so fell out that these things were done on the very day on which their divine worship had stopped years before. Okay? For it was that the temple had been made desolate by Antiochus. We just talked about that. Okay? And it continued so for 3 years. But it was dedicated anew on the same day, the 25th, on the 400th of the year. And this desolation came to pass according to the prophecy of Daniel, which had been given 408 years prior. For he declared that the Macedonians would dissolve that worship for some time. This is what we call
Hanukkah.
Hanukkah. This is where the Jews came up with the tradition of Hanukkah. It was the rededication of the temple by Judas Maccabeus as they rebuilt things, cleansed the temple, rededicated it, and started then temple service.
And the oil lasted 8 days, but they only had 1 day supply.
That's right.
Yeah.
There were a lot of miraculous things that actually happened. Now, when these things were over, the nations round about the Jews were very uneasy at the revival of their power.
Yeah.
And they rose up together in trying to destroy the Jews and tried to gain an advantage over them by laying snares for them and making secret conspiracies against them. Judas made perpetual expeditions against these and endeavored to restrain them from their incursions and to prevent the mischief that they were trying to do to the Jews. About this time, King Antiochus, when this concern about these affairs had been added to his former losses, he was confounded by the anxiety that fell upon him. He developed distemper, which it lasted a great while, and as his pains increased upon him, so at the length perceived that he should die in a little time. So he called his friends to him. Now listen to this. He called his friends to him and told them that this disease was severe upon him and confessed that it would not end and that this calamity that he had experienced with this disease was sent upon him for the miseries he brought against the Jewish nation. While he had plundered their temple and condemned their God, and when he had said this, he died. Isn't it interesting that Antiochus realized that the reason for his death was what he did to the Jews and through the abomination of desolation? Okay? Now, I won't go on. If you want to read more, you're welcome to in this, but what happens, of course, is that Judas racks up an amazing number of victories with almost no defeats. Finally, at the end of his life, he enters into battle with 800 men. He's very understaffed and goes against a part of Antiochus' army that I think that had 10,000. And Judas basically says, I've never gone away from a battle, though these many years God has led me, and if this is where I meant to die, this is where I meant to die. And they enter into battle and almost win the battle with this very small force compared to the Greeks. And Judas is killed in the process. Okay? That's the end of his life. But he had a life of remarkable faith and remarkable belief. It's a very interesting story about him. So that is what's being said here. Let's go back to Zechariah.
Hey, Tim?
Yes.
Do you have a fan?
Do I have a fan?
A fan?
In the room I do.
Oh.
You want it to be turned up or?
Yeah, it's pretty hot in there. Or at least, is it hot?
Okay.
It's hot. That sounds.
Paul, you have to pull the chain to make it go faster, if you know what I mean. Got it?
Not that fast.
Okay.
Pull
Okay.
my hair off.
All right. So this is part of what is meant in Zechariah 9 when he says that I will bend Judah as my bow. Isn't it interesting? He really means Judea, but isn't it interesting that the man that led them is called also Judah after Judea? Okay? And I will fill the bow from Ephraim, and I will stir up your sons, that is the Jews, O Zion, against the sons of Greece. And I will make you like a warrior sword, which is exactly what Judas Maccabeus was. So, this is the Maccabean revolt. This is the first element and fulfillment of this prophecy. But there's another one. So let's read verses 14 through 17. Then the Lord will appear over them and his arrow will go forth like lightning, and the Lord God will blow the trumpet, and will march in the storm winds of the south, and the Lord of hosts will defend them, and they will devour and trample on the sling stones. And they will drink and be boisterous with wine, and they will be filled like a sacrificial basin, drenched like the corners of the altar. And the Lord their God will save them in that day, as the flock of his people. They are the stones of a crown. For whatever comeliness and beauty will be theirs. Grain will make the young men flourish, and new wine the virgins. Now, this is not talking about what Judas Maccabeus did, but rather this is talking about what Messiah will do in the future. How do you know that's true? How can you tell this is not about Judas Maccabeus? Verse 14, and the Lord will appear over them. He isn't saying, he isn't saying, I will. See, before he said, the Lord will lead the sons of Judah to be like a sword. Humanly. He'll enable them to do this to the army of Antiochus. But here, he's not saying that. He's saying he will do it. Okay? So we're not talking about the Maccabean revolt time. We're talking about a future time. And the leader of this time will be Messiah himself. He says, then the Lord will appear over them, and his arrow will go forth like lightning. So let's take this apart. Again, this is double fulfillment. Both in terms of how Judas miraculously was able to defeat the Seleucid forces, and of course also, it's also true of what's going to happen with the Messiah. Turn over 3 chapters to Zechariah chapter 12. Zechariah 12. And let's read 3 through 10. This is a very interesting prophecy about what will occur. And it will come about in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples. All who lift it will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. We see part of that happening right now. What's the condition of Israel and Jerusalem? Constant controversy. Should they have new settlements? Should they withdraw from settlements? They should give up more of their land. There's constant bombings. There's constant terrorist attacks. Okay? It's all being focused on the Middle East, of course, in relationship to Israel. Now, it says, verse 4, and in that day, declares the Lord, I will strike every horse with bewilderment, and his rider with madness, and I will watch over the house of Judah while I strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. So who's doing the warring here? God. Okay? Then the clans of Judah will say in their hearts, a strong support for us are the inhabitants of Jerusalem through the Lord of hosts, their God. In that day, verse 6, I will make the clans of Judah like a fire pot among pieces of wood and flaming torch among sheaves. So they will consume on the right hand and on the left all the surrounding peoples while the inhabitants of Jerusalem again dwell in their own sites in Jerusalem. What this is saying is that God will also enable the Jews, literally the Israeli army, and he will empower them to overcome the invading forces that come into them. Okay? In verse 7, the Lord will save the tents of Judah first in order that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem may not be magnified above Judah. In that day the Lord will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the one who is feeble among them in that day will be like David. This is how enabled the Jews will be to be able to effectively war against the nations that try to invade Israel. And he says the least of them will be like the warrior King David, like the angel of the Lord before them. Verse 9, and it will come about in that day and I will set about to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. And I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, so that they will look upon me whom they have pierced. Who would that be?
Jesus.
Messiah. Okay. And they will mourn for him as one mourns for one's only son, and they will weep bitterly over a firstborn. So what happens?
They recognize him.
They finally recognize him as Messiah. The hope that we just talked about, that Paul talked about in Acts, this is the fulfillment of the hope. This is what it's supposed to occur. This is the event. Verse 11, in that day there will be great mourning in Jerusalem, like the mourning of in the plain of Megiddo. Okay, he's talking about the Battle of Armageddon. Okay, so he's talking about this event that's going to occur. He says that the Israeli soldiers will be like King David at a minimum, and will subdue, quote, with sling stones. Just like David took sling stones and killed Goliath, the giant, the Israeli forces will be imbued with power to overcome their enemies. Now, when Christ returns for Jerusalem in this battle, it says he'll be seen by all. Notice what it said here. Go back to Zechariah 9. It says, and the Lord will appear over them. Okay? And his arrow will go forth like lightning, and the Lord God will blow the trumpet, and will march in the storm winds of the south. In other words, when Messiah finally comes, it's going to be very public. Alright? You don't have to turn here, but if you wanted to, you could look at a couple famous verses. Certainly Matthew 24:30 is one of them, where Jesus, talking about his own return, says, in that day, the sign of the Son of Man will be in the sky. In the sky. Okay? It will be public. Some people speculate, how can that be? I would guess the way it will be is he will put his sign in the sky over a 24-hour period. Therefore, within 24 hours, the whole earth will see it. That would be my guess, but maybe not. Okay?
Maybe he'll Skype.
Right. Okay. And then, of course, we could turn to Revelation 1:7, which talks about, again, his sign when he returns. It will be announced with a final trumpet. Trumpet, of course, is a really not great translation of the Hebrew word, which really is shofar. A shofar is a ram's horn that is blown by people that are skilled at doing it. It's amazing that they're able to do what they do with a shofar. Notice this has occurred before. This is a second fulfillment of prophecy. Turn to the book of Joshua. Joshua, by the way, Joshua chapter 6 and verse 20.
This must be Jericho.
It is Jericho. Okay? Joshua 6 verse 20. They've gone around the city. They've blown their shofars. They've marched around the walls. I'm certain the people in Jericho thought they were on drugs doing this. They haven't launched any military effort so far against the city. And then it says in verse 20, so the people shouted and the priests blew the shofars. And it came about when the people heard the sound of the shofars that the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went in upon the city, every man straight ahead. Okay? Jericho succumbed because of a miracle that was announced by shofars. In the same way, okay, interestingly enough, when Christ comes back for the church, it's at the
Sound of the
trumpet, the shofar. It will announce that he's taking the church home. And when he comes for this battle in Jerusalem, it will be announced by a shofar. The jig is up. Okay?
That's all, folks.
That's all, folks. Matter of fact, I will say this to you. Sometime we should study the book of Joshua. It's an absolutely remarkable Old Testament book. The book of Joshua is the Old Testament version of the book of Revelation. It's very, very interesting. Okay? Turn from Joshua over to Isaiah. Let's read this verse in Isaiah that reiterates chapter 27, what it is that's being said here. Go to verse 13 of Isaiah 27. Speaking of, again, this event where Messiah comes to Jerusalem, it will come about also in that day that a great shofar will be blown. And those who were perishing in the land of Assyria, who were scattered in the land of Egypt, will come and worship the Lord in the holy mountain of Jerusalem. The beginning of the conclusion, as it were, to Earth's history. That says back in Zechariah, go back to Zechariah now, to our original text. It says in Zechariah also, chapter 9. Nope, not too far. It says also that it says the Lord of hosts will defend them, and they will devour and trample on the sling stones. In other words, an allusion to David and his conquest of the giant. Okay, it says and they will drink and be boisterous with wine. In other words, rowdy, if you want to use that. And they will be filled like a sacrificial basin and drenched like the corners of an altar. Who do you think he's speaking of there? They will be filled like a sacrificial basin and drenched like the corners of the altar. What were the corners of the altar used for? And the brass altar that was made, that the animal was sacrificed for. What were the corners used for?
Tie it down.
To tie the animal down for the bloodletting, the sacrifice. Okay? All right? And of course, they then would accumulate the blood in a basin that they would then sprinkle on top, of the Ark of the Covenant. So he's talking about the peoples, the nations. They're going to be like the slaughtered animal on the altar. Okay? And God's judgment upon them. That's what he means there. He says in verse 16 of Zechariah 9, he says, and the Lord their God will save them in that day as the flock of his people. And it says they are the stones of the crown, sparkling in his land. For what comeliness and beauty will be theirs. And it says grain will be for the young men, and the new wine for the virgins. Okay. Now, he also says right here go back to verse 14. It says that Messiah will march in the storm winds of the south. Now, what's that mean? The storm winds of the south. Any idea?
Unless it would be the direction from which the nations are coming up against Jerusalem.
You're close. It isn't the direction the nations are coming. It is the direction someone's coming.
Oh, that Jesus is coming from the south to Jerusalem.
Right.
Because he went to Petra.
Exactly. See, people say the second return of Christ will be at the Mount of Olives. Okay? That is technically not right. The reason why it's not right is it's the third place he'll come. Okay? If you look at Isaiah 63, why don't you turn there? We've looked at it before, but I want you to understand this. Turn to Isaiah 63. There's this very interesting allusion made. Starting verse 1, Isaiah 63. He says, who is this who comes from Edom? The word Edom means red. Okay? With garments of glowing colors from Bozrah. Bozrah is an ancient word for what today we call Petra. Okay? Now, why is Petra important?
That's where all the Jews are.
That's where all the Jews are going to go. Well, a third of them will go. We think a third.
All the
Okay?
ones that are left.
Right. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 24? When you see the abomination of desolation occur, He said, don't even go back into your house and get your clothes. Don't even, if you're pregnant, good luck, run to Petra. Flee to Petra. And a third apparently do. And they go to Petra. And of course, we've shown, the examples of Petra, what it looks like, pictures. It's a natural bomb shelter, practically, right? And the Jews that go are preserved there. So when Messiah comes back, the first place He comes to is Bozrah. He says at the end of verse 1 of Isaiah 63, this one who is majestic in his apparel, marching in the greatness of his strength. It says, it is I who speak in righteousness, mighty to save. And then, rhetorically, the writer, Isaiah, says, why is your apparel red? And your garments like the one who treads in the winepress. I have trodden the wine trough alone. Now, you go, why are you talking about a winepress and a wine trough?
Blood of His crucifixion.
No.
Oh, well, people have been slain.
Turn to first to Revelation 14. Now I want you to see two passages here. Revelation 14, starting in verse 19. Okay? And the angel swung his sickle to the earth, and he gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth, and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came from the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles. I told you when I went over this verse before, it always has troubled me. Number one, how could in the valley of Armageddon, the valley of Jezreel, in that valley, how could you have blood that deep? Okay? But what you realize in this verse, in the verse that we just read in Isaiah 63, and in this verse, when he leaves Petra, which is southeast, okay, he starts a march up the valley. Guess how long it is, if you look on a Google map, from Petra to Megiddo? 200 miles.
178.
Okay, 178 points. All right. What's happening is, as he's, quote, marching up the valley to the northwest, all the nations are opposing him, their armies, and he's slaughtering them. He's moving up and he's slaughtering them, until finally he gets to the center of the valley of Jezreel, okay, and has this massive battle where he slaughters them, and we're told the slaughter is so bad that it takes the Jews 7 years to clean it up, just to bury the dead bodies. Okay? It isn't the Jews that slaughter them. It's Messiah that slaughters them. That's treading the winepress of his wrath. That's what it means. Finally, after that battle is done, he goes to his third place, the Mount of Olives. And he sets down on the mount on the east side of the Kidron Valley, okay, and walks into Jerusalem. So there are 3 places that Christ ends up coming to in his second return. The last one is in Jerusalem. That's in the battle that we just read about, where he puts down the forces attacking the Jews in Jerusalem.
He's been holding his wrath in a long time.
Long time. And there's a lot of it. That's the whole point. There's a lot of it. Now, let's finish up with this. It says that, back to Zechariah, it talks about these stones. You go, what's this all about, these stones? He says, and the Lord God will save them in that day as the flock of His people, for they are the stones of a crown, sparkling in His hand. For what comeliness and beauty will be theirs. So He's saying of the believing Jews, they are the stones of His crown. Okay? Now, what we see here is that they are like the king's crown and the precious stones in it. Those are the believers. Okay? And I think there's a very interesting contrast here. We talk about God's devoted love. In 1 John 3, verse 1, we talk about the love of God. In Romans 8, 35 through 39, we talk about the love of God. Who will separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus? Okay? In Ephesians 2, 4, we talk about what great love with which He has loved us. Okay? Now, I think there's a great tragedy here. And I want to show you one thing to close. I want you to go back to Ezekiel. And I want you to go to the 28th chapter.
$28.
28. I'm going to start reading in verse 12. Okay? That's right. 27. Okay. Ezekiel is told, Son of man, take up a lamentation over, quote, the king of Tyre, and say to him, Thus says the Lord, you had the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Now, who's he talking about? Not the literal king of Tyre.
Satan.
Satan.
Yeah.
He was the one that was in the garden. He was the one that was created in perfect beauty, not the literal political king of Tyre. So he's talking about Satan. Okay? Now look, every precious stone was your covering. The ruby, the topaz, the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, the jasper, the lapis lazuli, the turquoise, and the emerald. And the gold and the workmanship of your settings and sockets was in you. On the day that you were created, they were prepared for you. You were the anointed cherub who covers. And I placed you there. You were there on the holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of the stones of fire, which seems to be a reference to other powerful angelic beings. Okay? And you were blameless in your ways from the day that you were created. So how does he describe Satan? With this remarkable beauty that's like precious stones. He's so unbelievable. What is he called? Lucifer means the shining one. Okay? That's what it means. Okay? The shining one. But look at the next part of the sentence here. At the end of 15. Until unrighteousness was found in you. And you were internally filled with violence. And you sinned. Therefore I cast you as profane from the mountain of God. And destroyed you, you O covering cherub. And he talks about then what Satan went on to do in his career in corrupting the nations. I think it points out a very important understanding or principle in the kingdom of God. And it's in most of the Gospels, but the one I'm going to quote here is in Matthew 20, verses, well, I'll read it. Matthew 20, 25 through 28. It's in most of the other Gospels too. And it's a very important principle that Satan was completely and totally blind to. Okay? But Jesus called them to himself. And he said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Try to get power and control over others. Okay? And the great men exercise authority over them. But it's not to be so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. And whoever wishes to become first must be last. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for the many. Now, this is to me one of the most powerful verses in the Gospels, because it tells you that the way up is down. The way to real authority in the kingdom of God is genuine servitude. If you want to solve a problem, don't demand your way, but rather find a way to minister to its solution. Okay? If we would only apply these principles in our everyday relationships in our lives, that's right. Things would be so immensely better.
I think maybe it's because he wants us to do that so that we don't come into the same path as Lucifer did.
Exactly.
He had all this
Right.
stuff, and he was like, look at what I am, and that's kind of where it started.
Exactly.
So they-
Right.
In satanic rituals, they put spells on people to gain power over them. Okay? In satanic rituals, they make blood sacrifices. And in the blood sacrifices, they create a powerful magic. Why? For control, influence, and the perpetration of evil. Did you see the sweet little video put out last week by, come on, I just escaped my name. The singer, she grew up in Westlake, Ohio. Come on.
Oh,
Katy Perry. Did you see her video?
No, but she's evil.
The video is Katy Perry sitting inside a pie, being cut up and being passed around a table where people cannibalize and eat her. That's the video.
What's wrong with that?
Okay? It shows the blood, it shows the body parts, it shows them opening her up in this video. At the very end of the video, it stops with this container that she's in. Eyeballs, arms, brain.
Now, why did you watch this?
I saw, well, Steve Quayle had it on his site, so I went to it, looked at it. Okay?
What's the point of it?
The point of it is, it's the power of the elitists. It's the power of the Satanists. What do they want? Power and control for what purpose? For death and destruction. Jesus said of Satan, Jesus comes to, he's a liar, he's a thief, and he comes to destroy, kill and destroy. So anyone who is his follower wants power and control to create killing and destroying in whatever level, in whatever way they can do it. It's the exact inverse of the kingdom of heaven.
And what's so sad is she was raised in a Christian
Yeah.
family, and she said she sold herself to the devil. She had a choice to either sing religious songs, and she chose Hollywood.
Right.
She chose the other direction, and she said she indeed sold her soul
Yep.
to the devil in order to be what she is
Yeah.
today.
Power and
What's
influence.
her name?
Katy Perry.
Katy Perry.
She's well known. She's
Yes.
a pop singer.
Oh, yeah, she's been in the last how many Super Bowl halftimes,
Right.
and doing her Illuminati, occult, spiritist activities there.
And the problem is she didn't really sing.
Yeah, she has sold out, like Kathy said, to her soul to Satan
Right.
for power, money, and influence.
Right.
That's what she's done. You know,
I mean, she
if you
admitted that.
yeah, if you look and read the stories of people like Kanye West and people like this, there's only one way you get to the top in Hollywood, in the movie and music industry, and that is you have to submit to the Satanists. They use you, they, abuse you, and frankly, I don't want to get too graphic, but they sexualize you. Always. That's the pattern. So, at any rate, what a contrast to Messiah King who has us as his stones, precious stones on his crown. So, anyway, I'll stop.
And exhausted.
You're right.
And she said that she went as far as she could go until the directors and the professors and whatever told her, you will sleep with me
Yes.
if you want to go inside.
Absolutely. Always that way.
And she said,